and welcome to a special edition of Conservative Talks. My name's Justin,
And this is Jamie.
and
This is Buck.
he's our newest addition, our newest member of the Conservatives Talk Show. And
Buck's our registered conspiracy theorist. So
exactly, you can notice he's got the little. He's donning the protective equipment to keep you from reading his mind. So let's jump into a little bit about what the show is going to be.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about the two-way conversation that's not being had.
Mm-hmm.
We can call it the coward caucus of the U.S. Senate. We'll talk about and get into what that means. And then let's talk about, what Georgia's doing, because one thing that's big and which is a part of this whole conversation is school shootings and how do we protect our kids. So let's talk about what Georgia's already passed to help those efforts.
Absolutely. And in addition to that, let's go into what they need to be passing in the upcoming session as well. There's a specific piece of legislation that we've discussed on the show before that we haven't really delved into quite as much, and I would really like to be able to flesh that out a little bit more.
Cool. Yeah, I look forward to it.
Awesome.
So
absolutely. So
you want to hop right into it?
Absolutely. So as always, we would like to ask you to like and share all the content that you see of our productions out there on any social media platform that you run across it on, as well as subscribe to anything that you see that on. By liking and sharing and subscribing, and it really boosts our numbers up to be able to show that we are a much broader reaching organization. It really helps us to get to the top of that news feed to where more people are going to be able to see it, and we're able to get this out a lot broader audience. And if you wouldn't mind, and if you're able to, go to our website there. It's conservativestalk.org, and hit the donate tab, hit the sponsor tab in the top right-hand corner and the bottom left-hand corner, the bottom right-hand corner. And help us out to be able to produce this and to really be able to spread this and promote this. Every bit of what you're using to sponsor this goes right back into the show.
Absolutely.
So it's, in all honesty,
that's how we got to add Buck.
Exactly. Buck is a contribution from a sponsor.
Yeah.
Yeah. They really wanted to see in addition to the show. So there you go.
They wanted the third co-host.
Exactly.
But also, here's we can't forget my favorite part since we're doing a special episode. That's 164 days until we beat Stacey Abrams.
Hallelujah. I cannot wait to see the look on her face yet again. Although I wonder if she'll actually concede this time.
Look, I'm telling you, Brian Kemp is on a roll.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be great to see, how this all plays out and, how we all expect it to. So,
yes. It's going to be very interesting.
164 days. Don't forget to go out and vote in your general primary and make sure that Republicans can stay in the majority in the state of Georgia.
Yes. We know that there are some concerns or some, let's call it what it is, hurt feelings in regards to what happened within the primary. That's no excuse to not turn out for the general.
Absolutely.
If you are not turning out for the general, anything that comes after that is your fault, simply because you refused to take part in the process.
Yep.
So
you got to get out there and vote. November 8th is going to be very big this year. So let's go out there and stand up for our conservative values.
Absolutely. Don't be Mikey. Don't take your ball home.
Well, let's get right into it with the first topic.
Good. Okay. So mentioned that we really wanted to kick off the show with the two-way conversation that's not really being had.
Yeah.
So with that being said, we acknowledge that there has been a very tragic event that has happened in several tragic events that have happened in the past couple of weeks.
The most recent one being in Texas.
Yes. And then the one in New York as well. That being said, does that lead or does that give an excuse for politicians and elected bureaucrats to be able to come in and take away our God-given, deeply held fundamental beliefs of being able to protect our lives and our livelihoods?
No. And the reason why I say it that way is there are certain methods that I feel that could have been used and should be used more in our own protection of our children.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as of people who have kids, I don't have kids, but in the school system.
Somebody had to throw it out there.
The school system could do towards security.
And that's another thing we're going to get to in a little bit.
Yeah.
So let's not jump
try not to lose focus, but
let's not jump again on that one.
You're right. So that's basically how we start this whole
Yes.
conversation of like, maybe we need to bring guns or post-certified individuals back into schools, or more post-certified individuals back into schools, so that we can, start to do a better job. There's also like other things like different security systems that will lock down a classroom. I can't remember what state is doing this, but they basically have come up with this $400,000 system that makes all the doors bulletproof, all the glass bulletproof. There's a certain area that they can leave, or a red line in a classroom, to where the classrooms are now designed to where there's a blind spot from the door, and then they can set off a certain frequency of alarm as well as smoke machines. So whoever's in, the now school's IT room can kind of sit there and say, this intruder is in section 2, like sound the alarm and the fog machine. So then they're disoriented as they are, coming through. They can continue to do it until they can get someone in the school.
I got you. Although, and forgive me for, and I didn't, Jamie and I typically discuss some of this stuff before the show, and this is not something I had brought up with Jamie beforehand. This is just actually just something that popped in my head right now. Should it start before what happens in the classrooms? Should the reform or the whole movement start before there is a need for anything along that line? So, for instance,
do you mean going back to the individual?
Not just the individual, but the family style for the individual.
Well, so that gets into
the whole community deal.
That gets into a deep psychological debate that for me personally, I think when we come into these mass acts of violence, right? Especially like, and I'm not talking about, I'm talking more in a domestic terrorist situation, because I classify that for what it is.
Yes.
Like, there's a whole host of things that go back to one major thing, and that's our lack of mental health care.
Or even just the support of a family system nowadays.
Well, yes, right. But so here's why I go back to mental health. Okay. Because your support system is also a part of your mental health.
True. Yes, absolutely. It is one of the overall encompassing factors of wellness.
Correct. So like, when we start talking about the proper mental health care, we can't be immediate to jump to the way that we view healthcare now.
Yes.
In that facility with doctors and medication somewhere. This is something to where we need to start thinking about how we interact with our own individual friends, how we have a larger overarching conversation about healthcare. Because when I go back to this a lot, like a lot of times depression looks like happiness, and
I'm putting on a false
face to hide, what's really going on internally. And so in that, your support system has to learn when to see between the two and step in, as well as like when to step in above your care. So I brought it back to the recent incident that happened, because let's take a look at the story behind the person who did that horrendous act out in Texas. Right here is someone who, before he went and started shooting up a school, an elementary school at that, he crashed a car, harmed his grandmother.
Well, he killed his grandma, shot her in the face.
Yeah.
And that was shortly, actually, it was, I want to say it was just a few weeks prior to that, he was removed from his parents' home. His father was not living with his mother. His father was a convicted felon. His mother was a convicted felon. Removed from that home. Mother was living in another town. The father was living within the neighborhood that the grandmother was, but had no real significant ties with them. The grandfather that was living with him as well was also a convicted felon. So how he actually got the weapon inside the house is in and of itself an iffy story. But
I think know just as well as anybody else, criminals have a better access to certain situations.
Well, at that point in time, he was not a criminal.
But I'm not talking about him, but I'm talking about the fact that he could have gone through a network.
Very true. And I do think that comes back to the point to where we were talking about how it all comes back to the most basic blocks of American society, the family.
So,
or at least in my mind.
Here's why I separated those from when you first mentioned this, is because regardless of a individual's dynamic inside of your family, right, they can still be supportive.
Yes.
So that's why I say it comes back to your support system, because even if you had a whole family of felons, right, they could still believe in the basic principles of, interfamily communication, faith, and things like that. These are just people who've gone through bad situations.
And that's a good thing to note, because we look at what happened in New York. If I'm not mistaken, I'm not 100% sure about this, but I do believe that kid had both his mother and his father living with him at that time. But it also comes back to to the idea of what that role is for both the mother and the father in that.
Correct.
And I know both of you and I have had amazing support systems when it comes to parental guidance.
Yes. And so then that takes to the next level, right? Because then you see someone, okay, who doesn't fit the profile. Like when you start building the long-term profile of someone who has a history of these violent acts and what it leads up to,
yes,
a lot of these cases can go back to the same thing. It's just like people who interviewed or have studied like Dahmer or Manson or things like that. There are a lot of similarities or key points that they can point out to and say, we could have seen this coming if we had done XYZ then, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the kid showed up to school with self-inflicted wounds to his face.
Correct. So that kid fit the profile. When we start looking at mental health as a whole, and when I say take it to the next level, that is what happens when you see someone who doesn't fit the profile, who starts to come in and do horrendous things, or gets to the point to where there's an issue where they start to misuse weapons or guns, and to kind of bring it back to our topic about the underlying 2A conversation, because I think both of us have had different parts of that.
And the reason why my mind went to this was one of the issues that we're going to be bringing up here in just a moment on this topic, and that being the red flag laws.
Yes. So before we go there, I think it's a valid point to identify that there is no way to actually statistically try to plot whether or not more guns in an area or going to save someone's life. Right? You can point to how gun laws are not working because we have case studies on it. We have actual 6 to 10 years worth of data history to look at. Like take the UK for example. When the UK started implementing its gun laws, they started to see not just a spike in gun-related crimes, but also a spike in, malicious weapon like knives, switchblades, things of that nature. We started to see spike in those because what you have done is you have now taken the ability for guns out of the hands of people who would use them for good purposes and allowed the underground market of the people who are using them for a negative reason to like shine more.
Very true. I mean, there are actually,
but we don't have statistical analysis on the other.
Well, you're correct. We do have studies that show that. So, for instance, we'll use this for example. When Congress passed the Brady Bill and the Gun-Free Zone Act, you saw an actual spike in
impoverished areas.
Shootings.
Yep, in school shootings in impoverished areas because the
they were no longer
guns
secure.
were being moved without security. From without scrutiny from the outside public because it was supposed to be a gun-free zone.
Absolutely. So then that runs back into the topic of the conversation that is not being had, but I guess the U.S. Senate is now wanting to try and have and push forward, or at least they've been having it, but the general population, general public has just been saying, no, we're not having that conversation. And that comes down on Senator Chris Murphy at the moment. The Majority Leader Schumer has tasked Murphy essentially with creating a bipartisan coalition of Democrats and Republicans to really revamp our gun laws, essentially, or to make it harder for people to be able to have guns. And those fall into the categories of you have the universal background checks and the red flag gun laws. So for those of you who don't know, the universal background checks are essentially you cannot you have to have a federal background check whenever there is a sale of firearms. So essentially, so here in Georgia, if I wanted to go to my next door neighbor and say, hey, do you want to buy this pistol from me? All I have to do is just give him the pistol. He gives me the money.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a private exchange.
Yeah. It's a private exchange. And then sometimes, just for other purposes, people will actually make you fill out a bill of sale. And
absolutely. Yeah. And that's based upon a personal interaction there.
Yeah.
So what universal background checks will do will ban that completely. In addition to that, it also closes what they consider the Charleston loophole. Essentially, that is, it takes the current 3-day federal minimum for a background check to be ran and extend it out to 10 days. So you've heard the you've heard the euphemism. Well, buy a gun, you have to wait 3 days. Well, that's because there's a federal law that says that they have 3 days in order to get you that gun, or at least in order to do the background check. If they go further than those 3 days, then you can just go ahead and purchase it because it's on the federal spark.
Gotcha.
So
they want to allow
by closing
for 10
that,
days,
they want to push it out to 10 days
because the number of transactions in between guns. So it's no different than
it's creating a massive bureaucracy.
Yeah, because it's no different than it's expanding one, right? Because it's no different than the ATF doing. Like the ATF has to clear places where you can go in order to exchange guns.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So like if I wanted to sell a gun, and correct me if I'm wrong because I'm a novice at this, right? But it's my understanding that if I wanted to sell a gun to you, then we have to go to a certain designated.
No.
What I mean by that is like for a certain, there's certain part of that. There's some part of that where you have to go to a certain place, right?
I can literally meet you at Waffle House, give you a gun, you give me $500, and the gun's yours.
Well, yeah, I get. So there's something I'm missing. I don't know. Let me put a pin in that point, and then we'll bring it back up since we talk about guns in the ATF.
You may be referring to an actual FFL license holder.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Because
so
that person,
this essentially makes or nullifies any private sales and makes it to where you have to go through an FFL license holder.
That's what I was talking about. Yep. Because the license holder is the person
who will run the background check.
Who will run the background check and is supposed to be the person who facilitates the exchange.
Yes.
Because they're the ones who actually do the background check on the individual.
And pay a couple $100 to get the licensure.
Correct. So what I've heard too is that a lot of people are now, in order for them to do the background check for you, they're requiring that you do the exchange like with them present.
Well, you have to. Absolutely.
There we go. So, okay, now I understand. Now we're on the same page.
Yes. It is a requirement that they have to be present because they have to note in their logs and their books and their essentially they have to take it into their inventory and then turn around and take it out of their inventory as a sale. So they have to take it in as a buy and then put it out as a sale.
Which is why now and what Schumer is trying to do is so big, because then you're not only just making the bureaucracy bigger, but you're now
adding an extra step.
You're adding an extra step, but you're making the bureaucracy bigger and taking away what fair trade does.
Yes, essentially, because then you have to then turn around and pay the FFL license holder, essentially, depending on where you're at and everything, about a $40 to $50 fee.
A handling fee. Because then at that point, like, I have to pay you so that you can make a profit, right, for handling my background check, and
to pay for the licensure to do background checks
and fulfilling the intent. So really, what you're looking at is additional, like, let's say the license, like the background check costs them $40. Well, they're going to charge you $60 to $100 to $120, depending on what you're selling. You know what I mean? And you just made that bureaucracy a business.
And then consider this: the only way that firearms can be sold are through FFL licensures. What if they begin to then start giving out quotas and limiting the numbers of FFL licensures that they can put out there?
Which is what they want to do.
Yes.
Right. Or there's or they'll make it seasonal, right? Like we see with a lot of other things, to where, this is they'll start to see the season when more people are buying guns, and then that gives them more data to track the things that they can't track now.
Essentially, they're creating a massive registry list to keep you on it, and then to be able to, when the time comes, the next topic of what we're getting ready to run into is the red flag laws and the yellow flag laws, which allow them to know exactly what you have and where you have it.
Yeah. So then at that point, if I want to go to buy, hell, if I know, like if I want to go buy a rocket launcher, like, you know what I mean?
If you want to go buy one of those guys.
Yeah. Like if I want to go buy an AR-15 rocket launcher, anything heavy.
Technically, that's a little outside the.
I'm just saying, I know you're not supposed to buy them, but if I can get it in Chicago, I should be able to get it. Like, you know what I mean?
Again, that's something else we're about to touch on.
If I can get
giving away all the
if I can get it on the streets in Chicago, then like I should be able to get it, like, you know what I mean, from the ATF. I'm just saying.
So, but before you give the rest of everything away, the red flag laws, the second half of what they're wanting to push through. Imagine you had just gone through a nasty divorce, and your spouse said that you were this crazy maniacal person that beat her every day up and down, and quite frankly, all you did in your personal life was worship her, but yet she was pissed at you and she just didn't like you anymore. So she went to the authorities and said, this family member of mine who I've been married to for the past 3 years is crazy, and they could potentially hurt me or somebody else. At that point in time, if these red flag laws are passed within the individual states, then the sheriffs can actually come bust your door down and take your firearms away from you without any sort of due process.
One, that's a rabbit hole.
Well, it's not really, because it's actually happened in several states. There's actually been people killed over this.
So,
Connecticut, actually. There was a man that was killed because the sheriff's department showed up to confiscate his firearms, and they killed him because he wouldn't give them up.
To confiscate his firearms?
Yes.
So that's
because a red flag order had been issued against him.
That's a big one for me, right? Because what you're telling me is that at any point I could say my loved one or my loved ones could say to me that I have lost my marbles, and because I own X number of weapons that I've now had to register with a federal agency, that they can now just at any point be mad at me and just come in and kick in my door or have me taken out.
Absolutely. And imagine this, and this is not a knock at LEOs or anything along that line, but it has happened, and we have seen it happen. Imagine they get the address wrong and they go to your neighbor's house instead of yours.
Yeah,
and they kick your neighbor's door.
We do hear about things about that, and that's not.
And they end up killing your neighbor.
That's not. Yeah, that's not so much on law enforcement from a
global standpoint. Yes.
You know, it's more of a, what happens in the situation when your intel's off.
Yes,
and we all deal with that. What do you do when your intel's off?
There are bad apples in law enforcement,
and you make a mistake. Well, not even that. Like their intentions weren't there, but they're being made out to be because of an accident or a mistake.
Well, let's call it what it is. When it comes down to something like that, I would say it's more of incompetence than anything else. If you're going to serve a warrant on somebody and you're going to intrude into their private home, you have to. There's a certain level of competence that has to be there, and you have to match and meet that.
And you got to make sure that there's nothing else. Yeah. I'll agree with that statement.
But imagine that happens and it kills your neighbor who's completely innocent in anything and everything, and that happens. That's absolutely. I mean, that's happened before.
Which is the scary part about making sure that certain information is right on these registries.
Or just not having the registries at all.
Which I agree with.
But
or that's the same thing as, like, you know what I mean. Or think about this: people who may receive a benefit or something of that nature. Like, this affects them too. Like, we talk about cross the aisle. What happens when someone deletes your history because, they just wanted to, or they did it by mistake, or something happens in this computerized system now, and so then it changes. Same thing. I understand now.
But yeah, so another big issue or another big topic on that, one of the big things that we're seeing across the United States, particularly in a very reserved or very highly held community, especially today because it being Memorial Day, as our veterans. Many veterans that are coming back or that have come back from overseas have been diagnosed with PTSD. That now becomes an excuse to take away firearms from veterans. And it would not just be coming for, and quite frankly, when I say excuse, I mean that in the biggest terms possible, simply because our VA system is so lacking. They would use this as an excuse to do that, and as opposed to actually treating these veterans competently for PTSD issue related trauma.
Yeah.
So you're not just, so instead of giving the veterans the treatment that they deserve and that they need, you're just removing any sort
you're
of
removing the right.
Yes.
Because in a sense, what you're trying to do is say that because this mental state, they are removing the right from this individual because they don't know what may happen, and that's a testing ground. Instead
of actually treating them for them where that they deserve to be and have earned that treatment from.
Yeah, that, you know what, I had a similar conversation about, and this is a little bit of a rabbit hole. Okay, about like Chinese social credit versus what they're doing in now with Fortune 500 companies and the ESGs. I don't know if you heard about this. So, and I'll tie these two things together. So in China right now, in the People's Republic, they have what they call social credit.
Yes, now I do know about those.
And depending on how the government rates you as being a good Chinese citizen, right, gives you a higher social credit. So when you go, this score is used versus your credit rating, in a sense, on the rate that you get to borrow from, or if they just give you something or things of that nature, right? A similar thing is happening in American industries right now with what they call their environmental, social, and governance score, or your ESGs. So what your ESGs are is
your carbon credits, in a sense,
because what you now have is you have a private organization that comes in and evaluates a company and says,
or a government organization,
or, well, I'm getting to that point, right? You have a private company right now that comes in and says, okay, based upon the number of minorities that you have on your board and on your staff, or the number of carbons that you're releasing, or what is your governance like when it's handled for certain situations, how well are you promoting people, things like that. They're giving you this arbitrary score, and that score is how you rack up inside of their meets and bounds of what is a good environmental social company. So what my point to this is that there's no difference between that and the government doing it for individuals. This is just a step above before the government comes in and does it for individuals.
Do you know what the history is behind the term political correctness? So that
enlighten me.
That was actually a term that was coined by the conservative base, or the conservative political machine. I want to say it was mid 60s, early 70s. And it was actually, no, it was early 60s. It was used to essentially make fun of the Democrats who were pushing a very progressive ideology and very progressive agenda, aligned a lot with what socialism was at the time. The term political correctness meant how closely you were in line with what the current political establishment believed and
under the Democratic Party, which is a part of what everyone refers to as the big switch.
So that is actually where that term came. It was a mockery of, so it's essentially, political correctness was a term of endearment in Russia at the time, because it put you just how closely in line you were with the communist dictatorship that was in play.
Or like, to put it in more perspective,
exactly what you're talking about there.
Yeah, because to put it in more perspective from the United States standpoint is, are you in trend or not? Because we've all discovered big, I don't want to say big business, but there are certain areas of organizations or individuals who, doesn't matter how they operate, their the different EFINs up under them, or even their personal social security number. The basis for all of it is one thing: how can I structure this to get what I want? in a capacity standpoint,
Yes.
mental capacity standpoint.
So essentially, what they're doing is getting back
social
to
engineering.
exactly what political correctness
and
is.
and they've now kind of like more so structured this. And one thing someone used to always say was, I used to hear this joke all the time was, oh, is this political correctness again, or is this social justice again? When the last phase lasts. And the joke was like, oh, well, the last one lasted 5 years and we're only a year into it, and that's been kind of a ongoing joke every
that was a
6-year cycle.
A South Park joke.
I did see it there too.
So let's ramp this back into so all of these issues are being ramped up and rolled into justification because of these tragedies that have happened. They're not looking at exactly what caused these tragedies to happen. More so, they're looking at the tool that was used to cause these tragedies. Imagine, or for instance, and not to give anybody any ideas of how or what could have been done here, but imagine if this guy from Texas had, instead of taking an AR into the school building, walked in with a vest with homemade explosives strapped to it. Could have done a lot more than what he did.
Yeah, which is even more disturbing. But we went through that era too, where, like, I don't know about you, but like when I was growing up, I'm post 9/11, right? So the big thing when I was in school was people making bomb threats, like, which is similar to.
I'm both pre and post.
Which is kind of like, in a weird sense, the mental crisis area that we're in now. People with mental health disorders, regardless of their situation, will go back to the first lead of trauma as a way to express themselves to get that help.
So let's look at what some of the major names in the Democrat Party and some of the statements that they're using to push this capacity, or to really push this agenda that they're using on this. And I'm going to be reading actual direct quotes from them on this. So it is. So this comes from Chuck Schumer, Democrat majority leader from New York. It is one nation under a gun, or under guns. That is simply heartbreaking. Heartbreaking to think that this is the legacy that older generations are leaving behind for young Americans. One nation under guns. The second one of that being this coming from the actual Democrat who's been tasked with spearheading the
Murphy from Connecticut.
Yes, the whole new gun control laws. He says voters get to decide this. Ask your candidates this fall. Are you supportive of universal background checks? Do you think that 18-year-olds should have access to military-style assault weapons? If they say yes, if they support the current law and don't support reform, then don't send them back to Congress. Something I think that is uniquely interesting about specifically about Murphy's comment there. And this was made on Sunday, not Memorial Day, but the day before. He apparently forgot what Memorial Day was. It was about the 18-year-olds that were in the ground that gave their lives with military weapons to be able to have him to make his asinine comments.
Yeah. And that's the other part about this, right? And you send an 18-year-old to war with an assault weapon, but think that they shouldn't be able to purchase one on their own at the same age if they just choose to be an individual citizen. So you can't speak out both sides of your mouth about what that age limit is, which I think is for a larger push anyway, because we've already moved most places have already moved tobacco to 21, just like everyone got moved to alcohol being 21. Before too long, I fear that we will see a time where, in order to even be in the military, you have to be 21 years of age.
I don't think so. I don't think that'll come. I think they'll maintain 18. Although I do want to say and point this out.
Or even before that, purchase a gun at 21.
Well, I mean, they're definitely moving to that. Regardless across the board, there are several states that are doing that.
Well, then the only other
California's already done that.
Because then the only other thing after that is to push the age to join the military to 21.
So think about this. They think that you are not mentally capable of carrying a weapon or to be able to purchase a weapon as a civilian at age 18. You're only able to be 21. You should only be able to be 21 to do it. But yet you're able to carry actual military, actual fully automatic weapons that could literally take apart buildings just by themselves at 18. Yet they want to give, or they've expressed support of giving the most devastating, the most destructive thing out there to 16-year-olds. And that's the ability to vote.
Well, it's because they can feed the trend, right? Because that goes back to, this our other conversation about political correctness being following the majority and following the main trend of the, and I don't want to say majority in the sense of what the people are thinking, but majority in the sense of what is hip and now. Because the MTV effect.
The most devastating thing on the face of this planet is a vote. Because
in a democracy.
Well, democracy, in all honesty, a democracy is the only place where you get a vote, or a representative democracy.
Which is my point, right? Like in a democracy, that's the only most powerful thing you have outside of a, representative or democratic republic or whatever, any form of political system where an individual has a say so.
That's the most devastating.
Everything else
on this place of the planet.
Correct.
Simply because they're able to say whether or not the bombs drop. Much more devastating weapons than can be purchased over a counter. So, and they're willing to give that to younger people than what they are willing to allow folks to buy over the counter.
They just think that I know that's a very interesting concept, because the only reason why you would think that way is because you would think that there would still be a level, there would still be a majority out of that of people who were of a older age range. You see what I'm saying? Like let me elaborate a little bit. I would not personally, but I could see the concept of what they're trying to do is drop the age because they know that they already have the attention of this age range based upon like what is trending now on places in modern media, right? You have these TV shows coming out about these topics, which is being subliminal or not, just in your face. There's still things that younger generations think about that older generations don't think about, but you still have to be conscious of the fact that you still have to be the majority over them in order to allow that additional age range in, because then they could outweigh you.
No, I get what you're saying with that, and I think you're absolutely correct on that.
I think about that for like a weird example. When I was in college, I went to college in a small town, and at one point they were looking at trying to make all the on-campus residents pay a hotel motel tax in addition to their tuition. Okay. The only compromise for that would be that if they were paying a hotel motel tax or any other form of a residency tax, like a property tax, because they would stay there for so long, then you would have to give them a vote, which then at that point, because of the size of the town, the student population would outweigh the regular population.
Yes.
And then you could get into a scary scenario that we told them that your student body president could also double as your mayor.
Well, yeah.
And then rotate your council that way.
I see. So how do you see this in relation to the 26th Amendment? So the 26th Amendment being taking the legal voting age from 21 down to 18. And that was fundamentally because of the fact that if you're able to go to war and you're able to die for your country, then you're able to vote and make these decisions. If the Second Amendment is a fundamental part of our country, then can they legally raise it to 21 and make it to where you are not able to effectively make a decision on this?
I think they could. I don't think they should. Because, and we all know how hard it is to either add or change an amendment, right? But that would be the process. I see that as a secondary process if they can't continue to get gun laws changed, because their target right now is gun control laws.
Taking them just all together.
Taking them all together.
Buttigieg said, "We're coming after your ARs."
So if you cannot get that done, then what you try to do is do a constitutional change that drops the age, changes the voting age.
Well, they've done that, yes.
Right? Changes the age of when they can purchase guns and join the military. Because once you start messing with that from a constitutional standpoint, then all those other rights and laws that are inside that way automatically just become, they don't automatically get passed, but you have to restructure your legal system to match what you would have changed constitutionally.
I can see where you're heading on that. I can see where you're doing with that. So let's bring up some of the other stuff that some of our fearless Democrat leaders have said. Specifically, let's get into two gaffes that our current leader and our current president has made over the weekend. And these were made today on Memorial Day as he was leaving the Texas town, leaving Delaware to fly to lay wreaths in at the memorial in Arlington. And he says, and this is quote, "Second Amendment was never absolute. You couldn't buy a cannon when the Second Amendment was passed. You couldn't go out and buy a lot of weapons."
What?
Now, historically, that is 100% inaccurate.
Yeah. Because at the time that they passed the Constitution, you really could go buy and get whatever you want if you had the money.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact,
which is why they felt it as an inalienable right.
Well, yes, and our country in of itself was founded, or was essentially, or at least our military at that point in time was bought on private funds.
Yep.
It was private funding that was able to buy all the cannons, all the muskets, all the pistols, everything at that point in time.
Because the government didn't have any money.
Exactly. There was no
government. Yeah, there was no government.
So absolutely, at the time of the Second Amendment, private citizens were able to get anything they wanted to. Had the nuclear bomb been available at that time, they would have been able to buy it. Planes, tanks, private citizens actually bought warships.
Bought cannons.
Well,
literally,
not just cannons.
Back to the quote,
but Navy warships, the big wooden boats that sailed the seas and blew everything up. Those were privately funded. Those were the most advanced pieces of military technology at the time, and they were bought by private funds.
Well, it also goes back to, think about the, look at the difference in innovation between NASA and what's getting ready to happen with SpaceX and how,
Exactly. SpaceX is light years above NASA now.
NASA ended up shutting down and leases these facilities out to your Dragon, your SpaceX, and all these other space exploration, or Axiom, or all these other aerospace innovative places, because, the government realized that its role is just more of a facilitator and a regulator than it is as the actual
not regulator. Well, to a degree, regulator.
NASA's becoming a global regulator of aerospace.
Well, I would say that's maybe what they're becoming, but that was not.
That's not what their intention was. That's not what their intention was.
Yes,
but just like any other government role,
it's always expanded and gone beyond its means.
It's
a power grab.
Most time, think about this, right? Most government agencies kind of come out as a regulatory body to stop something.
Yes,
or as a task force to stop something. And then when they realize that, okay, this network is bigger than one of the other networks, and they make it a department. And their only job at that point, once it becomes a department, is not like a governmental vigilante group, but more of a regulatory body. NASA is now, I use the term vigilante group lightly, but they're not the people racing with physics degrees to get into space anymore. They are the ones who say, they're the kids who made A's in physics and go, "Hey, C student, your math is right, but you need to be cautious. You can't do this way."
The farmer astronaut.
Well, it's just like a friend of mine once told me. He said, always remember when you start looking at your master's or your professional studies or your law degree, because he was a lawyer, he said A's become judges, B's become prosecutors, C's become millionaires. Because the thought of it is that once you understand the space and that becomes your world, it is what it is.
Mm-hmm. Just ask Bill Bob Thornton about that. He can tell you all about that. The NASA coming and trying to regulate. So the second quote that he made today, or the second gaffe, which, frankly, from a standpoint of being a combat medic in the Army, or former combat medic in the Army, Joe Biden said the following: "They said a 22 caliber bullet will lodge in the lung, and we can probably get it out. May be able to get it out and save the life. A 9mm bullet blows the lung out of the body. Why should we allow people to have military-style weapons, including pistols, with 9mm bullets that can hold 10 rounds or more?" Obviously, nobody informed Joe Biden that 99.99% of all of these so-called military-style weapons are 22 caliber weapons.
Yeah.
Your 223 rounds, these guys right here, these are 22 caliber round bullets. Those right there are the ones that they're saying get lodged in the lung and that they can remove and take out. Actually, that is factually incorrect as well, just simply because the reason why it was designed. A 22 caliber round, outside of a 22 caliber or 22 caliber short round or short rifle or a long rifle, or a 22 caliber Magnum, which a Magnum at this sense would still be able to do everything that they're talking about. But a 22 caliber long rifle round, which is the little bitty guys about that big right there, those are the only ones that he's talking that they're referring to as being able the ones that would just puncture and go out. But actually, 22 caliber long rifle rounds were the preferred rounds of Hitman back during the mob days, because they would penetrate one side of the skull and not leave the back and would rattle around inside the brain.
Which is like, yeah, because that goes back to like what I might, again, me being the novice, knows about it. It was like 22s are the rounds that really bounce on. They call them gut busters because they go inside, but they're not going to. They don't have the force to puncture you and go through the other side. Really, what they're doing is once they penetrate you, they're bouncing inside of organs, bouncing off of bone.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right.
So they're really doing more damage than anything. Like a 9mm
round is
it comes through your chest, it hits your rib cage. It's not going straight through your lung. It's going.
It'll puncture a lung. It'll puncture a rib. It'll continue through the lung. It's not going out the back, depending on what it is. It will. Yeah. If it is, for instance, a hollow point round, it's not going out the back. If it's a full metal jacket, the likelihood of it going out, yes, but the likelihood, but the actual entry wound and exit wound of a full metal jacket is so small that I could literally put a patch on either side of your chest and you would be just fine.
Yeah,
your lung would actually heal itself. But he's taking a concept like that and blowing it way out of proportion. The reason why I bring this up is what he's saying there. 22 caliber bullets are safer than 9mm. Well, AR-15s are 22 caliber bullets, guys. So
he's contradicting himself.
Exactly. So either it's 9mm or the AR-15s. Which one's more dangerous?
Because from this perspective, the 9mm are more dangerous because
at least what we're saying. Yes.
Yeah.
But
that's why like
these 22. So the 223 and to get a little into it, and I know this is way outside of, but it's a tumbling round. When it hits 223, when it hits, it begins tumbling, and it creates what's called a cavitation effect, where typically when you see an entry wound, it's very small. It's the size. Well, an exit wound is significantly larger. I mean, we're talking about a hole that you can put your fist through.
Yeah.
This round was designed for that, just because when it tumbles, it creates what's called a cavitation effect. It creates a shock wave that goes out through the tissue, expands, it contracts, expands, contracts, expands, contracts, to the point to where it becomes so damaged, it essentially liquefies, and it blows it all out the back, which is what a 223 round does. But at the same time, it's still a 22 caliber round. More than what you want to know. I know that.
No, but like, I'm here for it because I have a lot to learn.
And we're teaching them. So let's get into the next topic. Let's talk about the Republican members of the 2A Coward Caucus, specifically the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, they joined the list.
Yes. So we have we have the the head of the snake, which is Mitch McConnell.
Which I do kind of find very interesting, because now he wants to work with the Dems on passing new gun laws after decades of filibustering gun control laws.
He literally came out and told Senator John Cornery and encouraged him to work with Democrats to come up with an effective gun control laws, including background checks and red flag laws or red flag law incentives. Literally told him to encourage him to do it.
Okay, I don't agree with the statement, but for the purpose of devil's advocate, right? I will say this: Mitch McConnell is a very sneaky person, and he could be using this as an attempt of an olive branch to find out what they're doing and write something to prevent it.
All he's got to do is keep his caucus together and prevent it altogether. He's got 50 votes. There's no need to extend an olive branch when you have 50 votes.
But here's the thing, and here's the area that we're in, right? Because you're starting to see more and more people wanting us to find solutions, across aisle solutions on things, versus just upright saying no.
I agree to disagree on that one.
There has been, like, don't get me wrong, like, there's some things that I believe that fundamentally as a party and as individuals, like, we have to 100% come out and say no on. Okay. But like, there are certain things that we do need to look at and just not create a complete wall on.
Such as?
I don't know. I can't think of anything good right now. But what I'm saying, everything right now that I have is a hard no. But
exactly.
But I'm saying I see where this is going, and I see the value in potentially one day looking at some of this and going, okay, like, we need to look at what's the best for society as a whole.
So essentially, what you're saying is that we need to be working with the Democrats in an effort to potentially come up with solutions in the future that could be bipartisan in nature, that both sides could agree on,
and don't effectively affect our core values.
Yeah, they passed something like that late last year. It's called the infrastructure package.
Here's Justin being a jackwagon, because it's not because what I'm saying is like,
dun 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 dun.
As a whole, our representatives have to learn how to get along to move our country forward. They have to. We can't continue to have decades of gridlock because there's some things fundamentally that we just don't get along with. Put the fundamental differences aside and work on what we can as like a whole.
Well, it was the progressive movements that we saw that have led to where we are now, the progressive change. It was Republicans coming out and making these deals with Democrats that put us where we are now.
No, I think there are areas that are not working. I agree with that. I agree. There are areas that are not working at all. But there are areas where we have come together and made change that I think have grown our country as a whole. One of the big ones that I will say is how we expanded technical colleges back in the 90s. Technical colleges used to not be in the same boat. Nope, it's not. It's the same thing. It is literally the same thing. Only difference is that we only focus on our platform key issues and not focus on areas to where we can actually say, okay, I'm going to work with you on this. That's where we are.
Well, I mean, that you're talking about things that are going to be mutually beneficial throughout the entire America, as opposed to what I'm referring to as Republicans essentially
holding down the hatches,
essentially being traitors to the cause and to what they're trying to do.
A traitor.
It is. The infrastructure package absolutely was.
What I'm saying is now here's the thing about the infrastructure packages. The infrastructure, that was not the deal we should have made. I personally believe that there is a deal for infrastructure that we should have done.
A hard infrastructure.
And that is a utility. That is a utility.
That's
software. And everything
that is hard infrastructure. That's putting wires in the ground.
Yes.
I'm talking about the Green New Deal aspects of it, to where we were building battery stations based out of China, and we were putting in these ferries that are literally not going to do anything at all other than cost us millions of dollars over the next 10 years.
I think there is a
hard infrastructure is where we need to be focusing on. That's what you're talking about. And data, absolutely 110%.
Correct. But we cannot ignore that being environmentally conscious is not a hard infrastructure issue.
True. If it's American. It's cost effective.
American bought and it's cost effective,
which none of what they did was.
Now, I will agree that the infrastructure bill that was passed was a loss, but we cannot ignore the fact that we continue to drill at a large amount of fossil fuels, and some of the things that we have that natural gas and fossil fuels are in need to be replaced with some form of
absolutely
a central renewable resource.
And the best effort and the best area that comes out of is the private sector, like we were just discussing earlier.
Agreed. I do agree with that, because we did this on another show where you finally got 8 to 9% of plastic is only actual recyclable. So what you have is you have all the private industries, or your largest plastic users, coming together and saying, let's think of something internally so that we can use more of the renewable resource. Those are the things that I am talking about.
Yes.
Those are the things that us as a party can reach out and say, okay, we acknowledge that there is an environmental component that we need to be respectful of. How do we begin to incorporate that with our core values? That is something that we can agree to come together on.
Absolutely.
Because we won't budge on guns. So stop talking to me about gun control. Let's talk about how we can come together on environmental. I'll agree to have that conversation if you leave my guns alone.
Well, the last time that Republicans came to the table for an infrastructure package, we walked away from the table with less than a quarter of that infrastructure package actually going to actual infrastructure.
And I think a part of that really does have to do with the fact that we weren't in the majority, or we were just like, that was it.
Well,
we weren't in the majority. We got beat up. We got beat that time.
We
can come back and put something.
We could have said no, because they still would have needed 10 Republicans to stay on board in order to get that out of the Senate.
Yeah, but that's like finding, look, you know just as well as I do, when you break down these bills, they're like, things that everyday people can write in 10 pages, they're writing in 120 because they got to incorporate the contracts and the deal from something else, right? So like,
when they design software to read through all that.
Well, and it's not just that, right? So like, we talk about the pork barrel spending and everything else that goes on, and how these bills get done. The infrastructure bill is a good thing, like a good example of that, because you got 10 Republicans who they need to make a deal with. And if I got to build an Air Force base in, down in Dobbins or up in Illinois somewhere, and I got to make that deal, I'm going to make that deal, which is how those 10 Republicans picked it. And they found a way to get that deal done. So as bad as it was,
they found a way to sell their souls.
It's not selling your soul.
That's what it is.
It's not selling your soul.
So the next one on the list is
selling your soul. Is
that's definitely selling.
I'm getting something put in my pocket, and I'm getting it back from my constituents.
Well, what do you think is in those contracts?
So here's the thing, though. You think someone sold their soul to like?
What do you think's in those contracts?
Well, look, I'm not. Here's what I'm saying. I am saying that someone going up there and making a deal, and in that deal helps the constituents in their area, is not selling your soul as much as if it was someone who went up there and in that deal they put that they were the contractor. You know what I'm saying? Themselves, which is illegal. So they didn't do it.
Yes, but you look at a vast majority of the members of Congress up there. They go in there and they're making less than $200,000 a year, but yet they come out multimillionaires.
Yeah. Well, it's
in those contracts. It's in those bills.
There are companies who, well, you're going to make me talk about other things, but I'm not saying that there is a way to do it, but in that, what I am acknowledging is there is a greater good for it. There is a greater good. Someone may have benefited off of it. Okay, sure. You can find multiple examples of that. That goes back to Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and the foundation and bringing all that up. I'm not saying it's ethical, but I'm saying that it isn't illegal. And in that,
well, in a sense, it's not, or at least they hadn't got caught on it yet.
But in that, the greater good was met, and jobs were brought to that area. Things were done. That's what happens.
Not in that. Well, on to the next one. As we mentioned earlier, John Cornery, the Republican from Texas, the Republican senator from Texas, opposite of Ted Cruz. He's wanting to essentially. He's the lead Republican on looking at enhancing background or enhancing the background checks and creating a federal system for incentivizing states to enact red flag gun laws in these areas. So essentially, he is the cornerstone of everything that they're trying to push from the Republican Party, outside of Mitch McConnell, who essentially told him, take charge on this, take lead, you be my guy. So John Cornyn is the one who's essentially leading the charge in the Republican Party and on these issues. And then you have Senator Tom Tillis, who is a big proponent of the red flag laws. You have Senator Portman from Ohio, who wants red flag laws and is working with Democrats in order to get this. And he's actually a lame duck senator as well.
So he's already retiring.
Yeah, well, yes, he will not be up for re-election this year. So he's going in and wanting to pass legislation that is going to be groundbreaking throughout the entire country to overturn our rights as American citizens while he's on his way out of office. Puts a new perspective on lame duck senators.
Yeah, but I mean, like, that's normal.
Well, exactly. But still, it gives reason for folks to be pissed off at him.
And which is also interesting because when you usually see a situation like this, hell have no fury like a lame duck elected official, because
that's very true.
Because when there's no campaign to be run afterwards,
mm-hmm.
you know what I mean, and there's still staging to be done, things like this are what you get.
Absolutely. So the next one, Senator Roy Blunt, he wants red flag gun laws, or he's advocated for red flag gun laws at one point in time. Susan Collins from Maine is a proponent of enhanced background checks and yellow flag gun laws. So it's essentially the same thing. Yellow flag gun laws are essentially the same thing as red flag. It's just a monster of a different name. And then you have, of course, Mitt Romney, who wants enhanced background checks and red flag laws. Then you have Marco Rubio, who actually put forth legislation to bring a federal incentive program to states to enact red flag gun laws. Then you have Senator Lindsey Graham, the war hawk himself, who wants to implement red flag gun laws throughout the entire country, or at least create an ability for or an incentive system for red flag gun laws to be passed. Then you have Senator Pat Toomey, who is interested in expanding background checks, and he is also retiring as well. So he wants to come in and implement these universal background checks, or at least he's interested in doing this, or some extent of it, on his way out of office. And then you have Senator Bill Cassidy, who is open to the discussion, including these background checks.
So what you're looking at, what you're really looking
all
at is
11 of these senators
can impact and actually get this thing passed
out of the Senate. Yes, exactly.
Because these three now are willing to negotiate on this issue.
So there is a path forward,
which will give them their supermajority,
which gives them their 61 votes in this instance,
which gives them over the supermajority right.
Well, it gets them over the filibuster. Yes,
yeah, that's what I mean. Because to me, beating a filibuster is essentially the equivalent of being able to pass something by supermajority.
Yes. But yeah, so there is essentially a path forward with this, and it's through these Republicans. They have in their past expressed interest in allowing several of these to come forward. Actually, Toomey put forth legislation with
damn me if I do, damn me if I don't. But I think like finally just having the conversation and then shutting it down is a good thing.
Well, Toomey actually pushed forward with Murphy, the guy who was wanting to push for this and passing a national universal background check.
It was the three of them. It was McConnell, Murphy, and Toomey. Who
Murphy is a Democrat. But yeah, absolutely. Biden was sitting inside the room with Murphy when that piece of legislation failed, but.
Well, those are the three who have kind of like wanted to do this national push from a bipartisan standpoint for a long time. Like when you start thinking about who's willing to cross the aisle to make some of these deals, those three fit in a lot of different crevices.
Yes.
And among the gun activists and control camps, as you can call them, these are three predominant faces across the board because they're having a conversation with everyone.
Absolutely. So it's interesting to think that although we do have we are in the minority, but at the same time, we do have such a line and a limit to where we can effectively block things of this nature from coming forward.
Correct. So long as two of these or three of these don't.
Well, it takes all 10.
Well, what I mean is so long as we can keep at least three of them from biting into the plan.
Yes, that it would essentially take two of these that are on this list from going over to the other side. Mm-hmm. But the only ones that I really don't see moving forward with it would be Toomey and Cassidy.
Really? Because, I think there's a conversation that could be had to our neighbor to the south. Marco Rubio.
Rubio is actually the one who put forward the legislation for federal red flag laws.
I understand.
And Florida was, after the Parkland shooting, was the state that initiated it, and he put forward that legislation and modeled it after what Florida had done, and then is now advocating for it again.
Which is why I think he is an individual who is worth having the conversation with. And here's why I say that, okay? Because Rubio is, remember in 2015, he had a very good shot at being the presidential nominee. And as our country continues to progress, he has the ability to partner with DeSantis on a lot of things that could really be impactful from a national standpoint. I think having the conversation about realistic gun legislation is worth having with someone like Rubio.
Well, in my mind, the only realistic legislation or the only realistic discussion about legislation would be the piece of legislation that our congressional member, Marjorie Greene, has put up in regard to the SAPA legislation. And that takes us into our next topic that we were wanting to kind of flesh out a little bit more. And again, just my opinion on that part. But the must pass 22 or the 2023 legislation for the state of Georgia. We passed constitutional carry. With all of the rumblings about federal gun legislation that's coming up, federal gun control is coming up, there's a piece of legislation that's specifically out there that's called the Second Amendment Preservation Act. And it's been passed by several states throughout the union already. Mm-hmm. Essentially what it does is it nullifies the ability for any state or local government to act with or to essentially comply with any federal law or legislation involving the Second Amendment if it is not, or if it is contrary to what the state law has passed.
So let me recap this with my Cliff Notes, with Jamie Notes real quick and see if I got this right.
Ruh-roh.
This would be.
What do you think, Buck?
I think he's telling me to grab my hat and put my hat on too. So this could be a situation to where we could now get a piece of federal legislation passed that would recognize states like Georgia who have already passed constitutional carry and put them.
So
just elaborate. You know what I mean? My ADHD lost me for a second. So like
when I mentioned the piece of legislation that that Congresswoman Marjorie Greene has filed under the Second Amendment Preservation Act, that was from the federal standpoint of it essentially was a defund the ATF movement. That's what it did. It just cut off federal funding to the ATF and essentially rerouted them back into the IRS and under the Department of Justice, to where that's where their budget money came from. And they were only allowed to do investigatorial procedures and processes on crimes
related to the buy and sale of the gun.
Yes, they were not a regulatory agency where they were essentially issuing licensures and telling people whether or not they could have what weapons that are
I see what you're saying. It's more cutting back on what they regulate more so than just being an investigative unit.
Yes.
Of the IRS, because if they like
the Department of Justice now, originally under the IRS. So
because they were mainly part of that component to try to catch who was doing tax evasion.
Yes, the revenuers
through arms races.
Well, not just that, but through a bootlegging. Actually. Yeah. So the new SAPA regulation that had been filed here in Georgia essentially said that any state and local agencies, governmental agencies, were not allowed to enforce or comply with any federal regulations involving the Second Amendment or firearms that the state had not passed legislation and agreements with.
So opposite of what my Cliff Notes said.
More or less, yes.
So it'd be state regulation that would come through that would not recognize federal regulation as far as the rights restriction among the Second Amendment.
Yes.
And all the states who have passed it before would be in a similar coalition like those who have passed constitutional carry.
Kind of like Texas has done. Texas has passed something similar to this, and so has Missouri. Essentially, it said, or under that piece of legislation, if, for instance, a statewide manufacturer here in Georgia wanted to start manufacturing suppressors, they could manufacture suppressors, and then they could turn around and sell it to private individuals here in the state of Georgia that were not going to be taking them outside the realm of the state of Georgia.
Unless this piece of legislation was passed.
Well, I mean, under this piece of legislation.
Okay. All right.
And because it says in that piece of legislation that as long as it doesn't leave the state, it cannot be considered interstate commerce. And at that point in time, it cannot be regulated by Congress.
Correct.
Under the 10th Amendment.
Because then it's only regulated by your Commonwealth or your assembly.
Yes.
Interesting. Because then you can basically manufacture any gun, again, using Texas and Georgia as an instance. I could manufacture a gun in Texas as long as it stays in my house in Texas.
Yes, does not leave the state. Yep.
And same thing with Georgia, because there's no intercommunal travel between me carrying my weapons over.
Exactly.
But the moment I carry my weapons from Texas to Georgia,
it
I am
becomes
now
a federal jurisdiction. Yep.
And then that's when the ATF or something of that nature can step in and try to regulate what was being moved at that point.
Yes, and at that point in time, under these laws, under these state laws, it would allow for state and local agencies to work with the federal agencies to then find and arrest you. But so as long as you were staying within the state that it was manufactured and where you're living, it is not a problem for the federal government.
So okay, so let me break this down for you real quick, because don't get me wrong, I am a big fan of our Congresswoman, right? As well as I know you yourself are, but this is one of those things that when you start talking about legislation like this, that a lot of people are like, hold on a second, like, what are you actually saying? Because you really start to have a conversation about, if you don't like it, it's like when you look at someone like Elon Musk, right? If you don't like what they're saying, you know what I mean, you think this is some outlandish craziness. Well, you're hanging out with Buck, and you got a tinfoil hat on your head.
Hey, don't bring Buck into this conversation.
I'm sorry, Buck. But or then if you do like the perspective, then you're saying, okay, this is kind of significant, because think about it when we start looking at crimes, right? Every state has some form of what we regulate as a state police. So like Massachusetts calls it state police, whereas in Georgia we call it the Georgia Bureau of Investigation.
Yes.
When you get to a certain point or a certain intercommerce travel of a crime, it's no longer your state bureaus individually. It's each state bureau plus the Federal Bureau of Investigation who are working on it. So just to, since we're in this area, as an example, would be like if someone did something in the state of Georgia and committed a crime, but then that crime carried over to Alabama, then there is precedent for the federal agency to come in and help facilitate the connecting of the dots, basically, of the crime between the two. So this, in a sense, would be no different. This piece of legislation would be no different when it comes to the regulation of guns.
Yeah, more or less. It's as long as it's within the state jurisdictions and does not leave the state jurisdiction, then there is no reason for the federal government to have any involvement, have any say, or really have anything to do with it. So just simply because of the fact that it's well outside their jurisdiction and they shouldn't have anything to do with it.
It's a state issue.
Exactly.
And then if something does emerge that is a crime, and the weight of trying to figure it out becomes too big for the two state bureaus that are involved, then the federal government comes in. It's no different than what we asked for anyway. But we're now just trying to have that implemented inside the gun arena.
Yes, that's essentially it. Let's see. The reason I'm looking up. So this is what Marjorie's actual SAPA regulation or legislation does. It says it cuts all federal funding from implementing, enforcing, or advancing any measure, law, regulation, or guidance relating to the lawful use, purchase, sale, possession, or transportation of firearms by any citizen for the of the United States for fiscal year 2021. It prohibits any federal funds from enforcing or implementing regulations or guidance issued by the ATF promulgated after November 1st, 2020. So essentially, that is what is being done on the state level of SAPA. So it's cutting any ties. So it's saying that if any state agency or local agency enacts or moves forward with any of these regulations or enforcements, or quite frankly, if they even try and charge you for a tax stamp on these things, then they can ultimately lose any state funding for this regulatory agency.
Now I see where this jumps at, right?
Because
at the federal level, it gives it back to states' rights, but at a state rights level, this is how it would actually operate, be implemented. See, that's something that a lot of people don't get. Because look, again, there's just some things where I'm like, are you sure?
Mm-hmm.
Are you sure this is how this works? Because again, you got to think about this too. Most people like me, when it comes to guns, right? Like we're still novice in it.
Well,
what I mean is like when you start talking about a lot of people in their use of guns, they know how to clean their personal guns, they know how to load their personal guns, they know how to shoot their personal guns. When you start talking about the large conversation of like national regulation of guns, like when and where I can't move, that's why a lot of people want it brought down to the simplest fact of, can I carry my pistol here or there?
Mm-hmm.
Or what happens if I go on vacation and I take it with me?
If you want to know, just ask me, I'll tell you.
Well, I'm not just saying for me. I'm just saying for like when people start talking about the conversation as a whole.
I understand.
You know, so when you break down a piece of legislation like that,
bring it local and bring it home
and make it make sense like that, it makes a little bit more sense to someone like me who knows more so how like the layer cake versus the marble cake. Because we get a lot of times people get confused.
I like that analogy.
You know, because, you know, the longest time, you know, 9th grade civics, they teach you, you know, federal, state, local, hear how it is. But as we got, you know, more and more in the 2000s and you really start progressing, you start seeing this marble cake where everything's swirled together. And for the longest time, I know the Republican Party, at least over the last 22 years, has been working on how do we get back to the layer cake and the separation between local, state, and federal.
Or at least the local parties and the state parties have. The federal party has not quite pushed.
But what I mean by that is
they would be giving ground in that instance.
Well, what I mean by that is this, right? Like, ask any federal Republican. They do not want to get involved with your state representatives or your local representative issue.
Or at least they shouldn't anyway.
They shouldn't. Like sometimes when they feel that they have to, or sometimes when they do, that's more of a personal thing than it is like a, you know, like a, I guess you could say a work thing. You know, they don't want to get into a situation where they're having to handle, you know, stuff that should be handled locally. If they do that, then there is a problem that has emerged that.
Well, that's HR1
is exactly that is larger than a lot of people are seeing, because again, your perfect one is HR1. HR1 is something that should not be in any conversation from a federal level.
Nope.
Right. At the same time, we've had so many across the board and across the country, state and local levels with all of this that people are trying to clean up as we go into the 21st century, that you got to have this marble cake scenario in order to finally get it right.
Well, I agree to disagree on that one. I would say
I'm not talking about as far as HR1.
Well, no. I'm talking about the marble cake scenario. I believe is what's led to a lot of the issues and the problems that we have now. If we were still at the layer cake and we went to the layer cake, or if we never left the layer cake, we would not be where we are now. We would be in a much better situation, much better place.
I don't think so, because I think the margin of error inside of elections, since we went to HR1, would be higher.
Well, we haven't gone to it yet.
Well, what I mean by that is in this conversation, right? The reason why I say that is because in the sense HR1 for election should not be done because that puts a over across the board federal regulation on the way we do
absolutely
it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that there are some fundamental things that may need to be put in there, like voter ID at a federal level. Like if you made it at a federal level to where every state made sure that there had to be some kind of national system, like your driver's license or your social security number, that had to be placed.
Careful
if you did an absentee ballot. Now you're saying that this person is a registered citizen who has the right to vote.
Now you're looking at national DMVs, and there's a lot of pushback on that one.
Yeah, that's scary because look, that's like national transportation, and which I think that's a whole nother boat that I don't want to get into because I do believe that there to a certain degree.
I see what there should be certain protections that should be put out there.
Correct.
That blanket the entire country. For one instance, at least in my on my thoughts of you, and I believe on yours as well, the national ban on abortion. And that's one thing that should be done across the state or across the country from a federal level. There should be no state. I say there should be no state identification there, but the state should not really be weighing in on that, just simply because they should not be weighing in on the ability for them to come in and take an innocent life. But
so
it's more of a moral point at that point in time.
Yeah. So
you're getting into some
see what you're saying
area
because
that,
so like to go back, like for me, Roe versus Wade, right? That should be removed from the federal level because that is something above the federal level, right? But there should be a base level standard. Like the base level standard for Roe v. Wade should be states decide, right? That should be the decision in my mind. Whereas like when we start talking about a underlying voter national thing for voting, should be that voter identification is required in every state, regardless of how the state chooses how to do it. Some people may do it by issuing a ID number only, DMVs only, social security numbers only must be put on there, or a combination of both like the state of Georgia does. But there should be a cap in what is done so we can actually identify who is there, not what HR1 did in amnesty.
Yes.
To where it says, all you got to
do is declare you're a citizen, you can vote.
And you know what I mean? You got the day before the election, you can come in and say, oh, I got this number, I can vote. Right. Because then it goes back to what we're talking about with the ATF expansion. For a bureaucracy, I got a lot of time where I got to try to figure out all these individual numbers and see if they actually
try to figure it out.
Yeah. You see if they actually even match. And then you get into the situation where the IRS is now to where you're like, I kind of don't care. Like, I'm going to audit so many people per year. And that's when bureaucracy gets out of hand.
I agree with that. So talking about bureaucracies, let's jump into the last point or kind of our last topic that we're really wanting to cover. And that's essentially current Georgia legislation that essentially could be used to protect our schools that is not being taken advantage of.
Yeah.
So a lot of people don't realize this, but I believe it was 2014, a piece of legislation was passed that would actually allow for local boards of education to allow for teachers to carry in classrooms.
That came 11 Alive did a story on that, didn't they?
Yes.
I vaguely remember this because I remember. Now I will say this
one thing. They did it here recently. Yes.
I don't know how.
I
don't know how y'all did it in private school, but I'm gonna say this: in public, if you went to public school for a little while, some of our teachers already carried. That's just because that's part of.
Well, we were also in a different time.
We were.
I mean, I had a shotgun sitting in the back window of my truck. So.
And I will never forget this day. One day, we were worried because, again, I grew up in the era where bomb threats were the biggest threat to your school. And there was a situation where social media at first got out. People were making these threats to, my high school kind of operated on like a compound situation where you had elementary, middle, and high really all kind of set on the same property. Right. So the threat was that something to the effect was going to be affected by all schools. So you had, all the high schoolers who had, who were big brothers or older siblings of everybody in all the other schools were like, don't worry, because that just means I need to bring an extra gun for my rack or put in my glove box. Just hope you and your friends are ready to shoot if something goes down, because I'll come get you and then you know what I mean, we'll get out of there. You don't see a lot of that anymore, but teachers, you know, a lot of teachers even then, before you had a threat like that, were already like, don't worry either, because I'm prepared as well to defend my classroom.
Well, a lot of our teachers around this area that grew up with firearms, that they were, you know, it's part of their everyday life. But then you look at folks who are our age, who are teachers, in New York, that have never even so much as actually seen a real firearm, let alone held one or touched one. And or even let's keep in the state of Georgia, in Atlanta. I can see some of the board of educations being a little weary of that, although I do think that they should at least make it a mandatory requirement, or at least a higher incentive. So, for instance, if we'll keep this in mind, if, for instance, there was a local education or board of education said, okay, if this teacher is willing to go out, get this specific training and keep it up to date, and to where they're involved with these types of interactions and these types of training, and they're able to, and they keep it up, and they actually continue along with these trainings, then they get X number of dollars extra a year.
So what? Okay. So I think this is separated into two conversations for me, because one, I think that what you're kind of describing too is having more organizations, more governmental organizations go on a merit-based system. Because one thing that you don't see as much of that you see in the private sector is you see people will expand their experiences, and at the end of the year you get a bonus because you added more experiences under your belt. Or you go get another job that fits your experiences. Whereas in governmental organizations, you don't really have that merit base increase. All of your increases are really more along the lines of longevity. So the longer you're in the organization, then you know this similar from the military, like, you know what I mean? Like
higher ranking, higher pay.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how long you've been in there to some degree. Like some classifications or ranks that you get to are only based in time. You can complete the courses that are part of that checklist, but then you're still waiting on the time before you actually get the promotion. So a lot of government agencies operate like that, right? Getting them more on a merit-based system.
So yeah, increases. Okay. I see you're like, I like that.
You see what I'm saying? Now, that being said too, I think it's we need to look at more of not looking down on or frowning upon teachers who choose to carry a firearm with them.
Oh yes, absolutely. I think that they all should be.
More so than this idea of, I guess you could say, bringing it to the forefront and acknowledging it. Merit-based will take care of that internally. Whereas if it shouldn't be seen as a teacher who decides to bring a firearm. If someone were to find out about it, they feel that they have to be shunned or punished. You know, whereas if you be like, okay, so-and-so carries their weapons, so-and-so chooses not to carry their weapons. And then you have the open discussion across the school, you know, as to the importance of it.
Well,
or, you know, the other opinion.
So the teachers union, the Georgia, is the Georgia Association of Educators. They actually are opposed to allowing this to happen, and said they will actively work against it and not allow their members to take part in this if it were to pass.
I see that though, only because of this, right? Because I think it goes back to where we originally started this with the incident in Texas. What happens when you get into a situation to where someone is not mentally sound at the moment, and they are now already in the vicinity? Do you see what I'm saying?
You referring to a teacher?
What I'm saying is that
the
organization probably is against it because you still don't know yet.
Well, this union is against allowing teachers to be able to do this.
Well, because the ability, the capacity, the variable's still there, right? Like you don't know what someone mentally is going through.
You don't know what somebody's mentally going through every time you get behind the wheel of a car and drive down the road.
Correct. The threat is still the same, right?
It's actually greater.
What needs to happen, like I was saying earlier, is the conversation I understand why they may not be ready to have that conversation as far as, allowing it, or I guess you could say not actively participating against it, because in their mind, this is a safe haven that must be protected. The school, the teachers, the students, we shouldn't have anything that can cause violence near it. So I get why they would actively go against it, right? But you still have to have the conversation of it not being a threat, but it being a tool that you could use in that area.
I got what you're saying with that. I mean, there are currently 4 counties that have it, or that their local school boards have allowed for this to move forward. And one of them being a county that's locally kind of relatively close to us, and that's Fanning. They actually have armed teachers in classrooms in Fanning. And that's one place that you don't really hear, not that they did before any of this happened, but you don't really hear of any sort of these instances coming out of these areas.
How does that model work, right? Like, because here's my question.
That I do not know. I cannot say that I know of that.
Is it a class that all the teachers take? Is it mandatory?
Again, I cannot.
That'd be interesting to look at.
Yeah, that's something we do need to look into
and do like a case study or exploration.
You tell us. What do you know about it? Okay, never mind. Okay,
I think Buck has an opinion on that.
But yeah, as always, we want to thank y'all for joining us on our special edition for Conservatives Talk. We're going to be putting out another episode again this week as well. We went a little excessive on this one, but we covered a lot of good topics.
Yeah, we covered a lot of things, and I think one thing that with the special edition we can kind of start to share with our viewership is now we've got a lot of feedback from some very sponsors, future sponsors, people who are interested in us, and we're going to start doing longer and more frequent shows.
What was that, Buck?
Frequent.
Oh, Buck says hello. but as always, anytime you run across any of our content, make sure you hit the like and the share button on any of that. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you would like to see Jamie and I get on and speak about, what you'd like to see us cover. If you want to come on to the show, if you want to talk to us, any of that stuff, let us know. Leave us a comment, and we'll get back to you on that one.
My favorite part.
Before we go to that, go to our websites you see on their screen, and please hit the sponsor tab in the top right-hand corner or the lower right-hand corner, and help us out with what you're able to, because Jamie and I are putting all this together, and we really need as much help as we possibly can to be able to help and expand and really grow this messaging as well. So just
absolutely
help us out there when you can. And now,
before that, I again want to thank all of our current sponsors and our
reoccurring
sponsors. Your input, as well as everything else, again, is 100% put back. As you can see, we make upgrades as you all would like. We'll have longer shows.
Buck says thank you.
Longer shows, add more things, more dabble into everything. But, thank you all again for being our current sponsors, and we look forward to having our new ones. And 164 days now until we beat Stacey Abrams again.
Absolutely. Still, just get the chills and shiver.
I love it. Well, thank you all for joining us, and Buck says bye.